What if consciousness is not something your brain produces, the way a liver produces bile or a lung moves air? Not a metaphor, not a provocation for its own sake. A genuine scientific question that sits directly at the intersection of quantum physics, neuroscience, and the one problem in all of science that 60 years of serious effort has not moved an inch closer to solving. The question is this: why does physical processing produce experience at all? Why does it feel like something to be you? Why is there an inside to any of this? Every materialist framework built to answer that question has failed. Not failed in the sense of being disproven. Failed in the deeper sense that nobody has even produced a coherent account of how you would get from neurons firing to the redness of red or the pain of pain. The gap between brain activity and subjective experience is not a gap that more data keeps narrowing. It is a gap that the data keeps clarifying as something more fundamental than a missing mechanism. Something structural. Something that points back at the starting assumption itself. And the starting assumption is this: consciousness is what the brain does. The brain is a biological machine. Machines produce outputs. Consciousness is one of those outputs. This framework is so deeply embedded in how the relevant fields operate that it functions less like a hypothesis and more like a definition. You question it at professional cost. That is worth noting before anything else. The people best positioned to answer this question are neuroscientists, physicists working on quantum foundations, and philosophers of mind. These are not people who ignore hard questions. They have built careers on hard questions. But this particular question has a feature that most hard questions do not. The answer, if it turns out to be yes, does not extend the existing framework. It breaks it. And institutions are not designed to fund the breaking of their own foundations. Here is what the question actually is, not in the philosophical version, where it gets discussed in terms of qualia and phenomenology and zombie thought experiments. In the stripped-down version, you are a physical system. Your brain runs electrochemical processes. Those processes produce behavior, memory, language, attention. All of that can, in principle, be explained mechanically. You can trace the signal from the retina to the visual cortex and map what happens at every stage. What you cannot explain, and what no materialist theory has explained in 60 years of trying, is why any of that processing is accompanied by a felt experience at all. Why is there something it is like to see red rather than simply a system that registers wavelengths and responds to them? The processing does not require experience. Experience is additional, and nothing in the physics of neurons tells you where the additional thing comes from. David Chalmers named this in 1995. He called it the hard problem of consciousness. The name stuck because it was exactly right. The easy problems are the ones that look hard from the outside but have a clear research path. Explain how the brain integrates information. Explain how attention is allocated. Explain how memory is stored and retrieved. These are difficult engineering questions. Nobody doubts they will eventually be answered in mechanistic terms. The hard problem is different in kind, not in degree. You can solve every easy problem completely, map every neuron, trace every signal, account for every behavior, and the hard problem remains entirely untouched. Because the hard problem is not asking how the brain processes information. It is asking why that processing produces a subject. Why there is anyone home. That question does not have a materialist answer, not a partial one, not a speculative one. No answer at all. 60 years of neuroscience and philosophy of mind have produced detailed maps of neural correlates of consciousness and zero explanation of why those correlates are accompanied by felt experience rather than occurring in the dark. The field knows this. The people inside it know this. Most of them have decided the answer will come eventually, that the framework is right and the mechanism is simply not yet found. Some of them have started to ask whether the framework itself is the problem. What if experience is not produced by physical processes, but is, in some sense, prior to them? What if consciousness is not a late evolutionary addition to an unconscious universe, but something the universe has been doing all along at levels we have not recognized? That question has a formal name, a serious scientific literature, and an institutional response that tells you almost everything you need to know about how uncomfortable the answer might be. In 1995, a philosopher named David Chalmers stood up at a consciousness conference in Tucson and said something that made the neuroscientists in the room deeply uncomfortable. He said there are two kinds of problems in consciousness research. One kind is hard in the ordinary sense, complicated, technically demanding, requiring serious work to solve. The other kind is hard in a way that is different in nature, not just in degree. And the field had spent decades solving the first kind, while pretending the second kind did not exist. The first kind he called the easy problems. Not easy in the sense that they are simple. Easy in the sense that we know, in principle, how to approach them. How does the brain direct attention? How does it store and retrieve memory? How does it regulate sleep, coordinate motor output, process visual information, and translate it into behavior? These are real questions. Answering them requires enormous scientific effort, but they are the kind of questions where more neuroscience, more data, more detailed models will eventually close the gap. The method is clear even when the answer is not. The hard problem is something else entirely. It is this. Why does any of that processing feel like anything at all? When you look at a red apple, your visual cortex activates in specific, measurable ways. Wavelengths around 700 nanometers enter the eye, trigger photoreceptors, generate signals that move through the lateral geniculate nucleus and into V4 and beyond. The processing is real. The neural correlates are documented. We can watch this happen in an fMRI scanner in real time. And none of that tells you anything about why there is redness, why the experience has a quality, why it feels like something rather than nothing. That is the hard problem. Not what the brain does when you see red. Why seeing red feels like seeing red. Take pain. We know the nociceptors, the spinal pathways, the anterior cingulate cortex activation. We know what happens in the nervous system when tissue is damaged and a signal gets sent. The science is solid. But the science of pain signaling does not touch the thing that makes pain bad, the quality of hurt, the felt unpleasantness that makes you pull your hand from a flame. You can describe the entire neural cascade in perfect detail and still not have explained why it hurts, rather than simply registering as information. Chalmers called these qualities qualia, the redness of red, the painfulness of pain, the specific character of what it is like to taste coffee, or hear a minor chord, or feel the sun on your skin. Every conscious experience has this inner dimension, and the entire apparatus of third-person science, which describes things from the outside, has no obvious way to get inside it. Here is why that is a structural problem, and not just a gap in current knowledge. Neuroscience explains correlates. It finds the neural events that accompany conscious experiences. It maps which brain regions activate, which connections are required, which disruptions produce, which deficits. What it does not and cannot do within its current framework is explain why those correlates are accompanied by experience at all. Why the electrochemical activity produces an inner world rather than simply occurring in the dark. You could, in principle, describe a system that processes all the same information, produces all the same behavior, and has no experience whatsoever. Chalmers called this a philosophical zombie. It is not something we can build, but it is conceivable. The fact that you can conceive of the processing happening without the experience is precisely what makes the experience hard to explain. If the experience were just identical to the processing, you could not imagine one without the other. You can, so they are not the same thing. That argument is not new. The deeper problem is that nothing that has come since 1995 has broken it. 30 years of neuroscience, including some of the most detailed brain mapping in the history of science, has produced extraordinary knowledge about neural correlates of consciousness. We know far more about the physical side than Chalmers knew when he stood in that room in Tucson. Global workspace theory, neural binding, predictive processing frameworks. Each of these is a serious attempt to connect physical processes to conscious experience, and each of them explains something. None of them explains the qualitative character. None of them closes the gap between the firing of neurons and the felt sense of what it is like to be the thing whose neurons are firing. The standard response from neuroscientists is that this is just a hard empirical problem. Give it time. More data, better models, finer resolution imaging. The answer will come. That is a reasonable position to hold if the gap were staying roughly constant as the science improved. It is harder to defend if the gap is widening, and that is what has actually happened. The more precisely we understand the brain's computational and electrochemical architecture, the sharper the contrast becomes between what that architecture does and what experience is. Detailed maps of neural activity do not feel like progress on the hard problem. They feel like very good descriptions of the wrong level of analysis. That is not a fringe view. It is the assessment of some of the most technically serious researchers in the field. The hard problem is not getting easier. It is getting harder to ignore. The more precisely we map the brain, the clearer it becomes that the map does not contain the territory, or I, and the territory is the only thing anyone actually cares about explaining. Before any of this makes sense, you need to understand one thing about quantum mechanics, just one. And it is not the thing popular science usually leads with. It is not that particles are in two places at once. It is not that the act of looking changes things because observers are special. Those framings are shortcuts, and the shortcuts cost you the actual problem. The actual problem is stranger, more precise, and far more difficult to dismiss. What quantum mechanics tells you, not as interpretation but as mathematical fact, is that physical systems at the quantum scale do not have definite properties until something forces them to. Not that we do not know the properties, that the properties do not exist in definite form. That is a different claim entirely, and the difference matters. Here is what superposition actually means. An electron does not have a definite spin until you measure it. Before measurement, the spin is described by a wave function, a mathematical object that assigns probabilities to all possible outcomes simultaneously. The electron is not secretly spinning one way, and we just do not know which. It is in a superposition of both states, and the wave function describes that real physical condition. This is what the equations say. This is what the experiments confirm. When you interact with the electron in a way that forces a definite outcome, the wave function collapses to one result, and only then does the electron have a spin you can write down. Before that, asking which way it was spinning is not a question with a hidden answer. It is the wrong kind of a question. This is experimentally verified. The double-slit experiment shows it directly. Fire electrons at a barrier with two slits. No measurement of which slit the electron passes through. What you get on the screen behind it is an interference pattern, the signature of a wave spreading through both slits simultaneously. Now, place a detector at the slits to measure which one the electron goes through. The interference pattern disappears. You get two bands, what you would expect from a particle. The act of measurement, the interaction that extracts information about which path was taken, changes the outcome. Not because the measurement disturbs the particle in some mechanical way you could correct for. Because the measurement itself is what collapses the superposition. That is what the data shows. And here is where the real problem starts. What counts as a measurement? The equations do not tell you. That is not an exaggeration. Quantum mechanics gives you a precise mathematical description of how wave functions evolve over time, and it gives you a precise rule for what happens when a measurement occurs. What it does not give you is a definition of measurement. The wave function of a quantum system evolves smoothly according to the Schrödinger equation until a measurement happens, at which point it collapses to a definite state. But the Schrödinger equation does not contain a collapse. If you apply the full quantum formalism to the measuring apparatus as well as the system being measured, you get a wave function describing the apparatus in superposition. Apply it to the room, you get the room in superposition. Apply it to you, observing the result, UG, to a superposition that includes you seeing both outcomes. At no point in the mathematics does collapse occur. Collapse is something added on top, a rule that works in practice, with no derivation from the underlying theory. Where does the quantum world end and the classical world begin? The question sounds like it should have a straightforward experimental answer. It does not. Large objects behave classically. That much is clear. A chair does not exist in superposition of positions, but there is no line in the physics that tells you exactly where quantum behavior gives way to classical behavior, no scale at which the Schrödinger equation stops applying and ordinary probability takes over. This boundary, or the absence of it, is the measurement problem. It has been formally recognized since 1927, when the Copenhagen interpretation was developed to give physicists a practical framework for using quantum mechanics without resolving the foundational question. The practical framework works. The foundational question was left open. There are serious attempts to close it. Decoherence is the most technically developed. The idea is that quantum superpositions are not fragile in a simple sense, but that interaction with the environment entangles quantum systems with an enormous number of degrees of freedom in their surroundings, distributing the interference in a way that makes it undetectable at the macroscopic level. Decoherence explains why we do not see cats in superposition, but decoherence does not produce collapse. It produces a system entangled with its environment such that the different branches of the superposition no longer interfere with each other. The cat is still mathematically in both states. The branches have simply become inaccessible to each other. What selects the branch you experience? That quest ion remains. Decoherence is a major piece of the answer. It is not the complete answer, and the physicists who work on it are generally clear about that. What counts as the thing that ends the regress? Some interpretations say the wave function never collapses and all branches are equally real. That creates different problems around the meaning of probability. Others say collapse is physical, a spontaneous process that happens at some threshold. Those models make predictions, and so far the predictions have not been falsified, but have not been confirmed either. And then there are the physicists who have argued seriously, technically, not mystically, that the regress only terminates in a conscious observer. Not because consciousness is magic, because consciousness is the one thing in the chain that observes without being observed by something further along. John von Neumann argued this in 1932. Eugene Wigner developed it further. The argument is not that your mind controls reality. The argument is that the formalism, taken at face value, leads you there if you follow it far enough and refuse to stop at an arbitrary point. The measurement problem has been sitting open in the physics literature since 1927, noted, discussed, occasionally footnoted, and never closed. And several serious physicists have concluded that the reason it stays open is that the answer requires something the field does not want to include. In 1989, a mathematician and physicist at Oxford named Roger Penrose published a book arguing that human consciousness could not be explained by computation, and the argument was not mystical, it was mathematical. The book was called The Emperor's New Mind. The core argument draws from a result in mathematical logic called Gödel's incompleteness theorem. Here is what that theorem says. Any sufficiently powerful formal system, any set of rules and axioms, contains true statements that the system itself cannot prove. A human mathematician can look at those statements and recognize that they are true. A computer running an algorithm cannot. It is bound by the rules of its own formal system. It cannot step outside and see what a mind can see. Penrose took this seriously as a technical constraint. If the human mind can do something that no formal computational system can do, then the human mind is not a formal computational system. That sounds simple. The implications are not. What does it mean for the brain to be doing something non-algorithmic? Every neuron fires according to electrochemical rules. Every synapse transmits according to physical law. Nothing in that picture looks non-computational. So either Penrose was wrong about the math, or he was right, and the brain is reaching down into a level of physics we do not fully understand yet. Penrose argued for the second option. He proposed that the answer lies in quantum gravity, specifically in the boundary between quantum superposition and classical reality. That boundary, as the previous section established, is exactly where the measurement problem lives. Penrose suggested that when quantum superpositions collapse, this is not a random event and not caused by external observation in the conventional sense. It is governed by the geometry of space-time itself. He called this objective reduction. The word objective is doing critical work there. The collapse is built into the structure of the universe, not imposed from outside. That gave him the non-algorithmic process he needed. A collapse shaped by space-time geometry is not following a computational rule. It is responding to the structure of reality at the deepest level we know. The question then became, where in the brain this was happening. Penrose is a mathematician and physicist. He needed a biologist. He found one. Stuart Hameroff is an anesthesiologist at the University of Arizona who had spent years studying microtubules. These are protein structures inside cells, including neurons that form the internal skeleton of the cell and manage its internal transport and organization. They are extraordinarily small. They are also, Hameroff argued, extraordinarily well suited for quantum processing. Microtubules are tubular lattices of a protein called tubulin. Each tubulin molecule can exist in two different physical conformations, two states. That is a qubit. Hameroff proposed that tubulin molecules could exist in quantum superposition between these two states, and that the microtubule lattice could sustain and coordinate quantum coherence across large numbers of these molecules simultaneously. This is where Penrose and Hameroff connected. Penrose had the physics. Hameroff had the biological side. Together they built the orchestrated objective reduction hypothesis, OR. The argument works like this. Inside the microtubules of neurons, quantum superpositions build up across many tubulin units. These superpositions are not random noise. They are orchestrated by the cell's biochemistry and by synaptic inputs from the rest of the network. That is where the word orchestrated comes from. At a certain threshold, the superpositions become large enough that their gravitational self-energy, the distortion they create in space-time geometry, reaches a critical point. At that point, objective reduction occurs. The collapse is not random. It is shaped by the geometry of space-time. And that moment of collapse, Penrose and Hameroff argue, is a moment of conscious experience, not a correlate of consciousness, not a process that produces consciousness downstream. The collapse itself is the experience. Each moment of awareness on this model is a quantum event. Consciousness is not computed. It is not processed. It occurs at the boundary where quantum reality resolves into classical reality, shaped by the deepest structure of the universe. That is what the theory claims. Now, here is what most neuroscientists say about it. The brain is warm. It is wet. It is dense with thermal noise. Quantum coherence is extraordinarily fragile. It requires isolation from environmental disturbance to survive. Laboratory quantum systems are kept near absolute zero for exactly this reason. A neuron at body temperature, surrounded by water and salt and constant electrochemical activity, is about as far from those conditions as you can get. The standard objection was stated clearly by physicist Max Tegmark in a 2000 paper. He calculated the decoherence timescales for quantum states in microtubules and found they would collapse in femtoseconds. A femtosecond is 1/quadrillionth of a second. Neural processes operate on millisecond timescales. That is a gap of 11 orders of magnitude. The coherence on this calculation is gone before it can do anything. The brain is simply too noisy. That objection was taken seriously. It should have been. It was clean, quantitative, and direct. For years, it stood as the primary reason mainstream neuroscience did not engage with Orch OR. If the coherence cannot survive, the mechanism cannot work, and the hypothesis collapses regardless of how interesting the philosophy behind it is. Then, the biology started coming back with unexpected results. In 2007, researchers studying photosynthesis found quantum coherence operating inside the light-harvesting complexes of green plants, at room temperature, in a wet cellular environment. The coherence was not just surviving thermal noise. It appeared to be using the noise, exploiting environmental fluctuations to maintain efficient energy transfer. That result was verified. It was replicated. It was not a laboratory artifact. Then came the findings on avian magnetoreception. Birds navigate using the Earth's magnetic field, and the leading mechanism involves quantum entanglement in cryptochrome proteins inside their eyes. Entanglement. In a biological tissue, in a living bird, then enzyme catalysis, where quantum tunneling allows protons and electrons to cross energy barriers that classical physics says they should not be able to cross. This happens continuously in living cells, at physiological temperatures, right now, in your own body. What the biology was showing, case after case, was that quantum coherence in warm, wet biological systems is not impossible. It is common. Evolution found quantum effects useful and kept them across hundreds of millions of years of selection pressure. The systems were not protected from thermal noise the way a laboratory is. They were doing something more interesting. They were working with it. The biological coherence findings did not settle the Orch OR debate, but they demolished the cleanest objection to it, and the field has not fully reckoned with what that means. In 2007, a team at Berkeley published findings about photosynthesis that should have changed the framing of the entire consciousness debate, and largely did not. Graham Fleming's group was studying light-harvesting complexes in green sulfur bacteria. These are the molecular structures that capture photons and funnel that energy toward the reaction center where it gets converted into chemical fuel. The process is extraordinarily efficient. Nearly every photon that hits the complex reaches the reaction center. Classical physics cannot explain that. Random diffusion of energy through a molecular network produces losses. The efficiency you would expect from a classical system is significantly lower than what biology actually achieves. So Fleming's team looked closer. What they found was quantum coherence. The energy was not moving through one pathway at a time. It was sampling multiple pathways simultaneously in quantum superposition and collapsing onto the most efficient route. This is not a metaphor. They measured it. The quantum beating signatures were there in the spectroscopic data, operating at room temperature inside a wet biological cell. Think about what that means. The standard objection to quantum effects in biology is thermal noise. Quantum coherence is fragile. Heat destroys it. The whole architecture of quantum computing is built around the problem of keeping systems cold enough to maintain coherence. And even then, the timescales are short and the engineering is extraordinary. And here is a green plant sitting in a field, processing sunlight with quantum coherence intact in the middle of a warm, wet, chemically chaotic cellular environment. Not for microseconds in a cryogenic chamber, continuously, reliably, at temperatures that should make the whole thing impossible. The field initially pushed back. Subsequent studies complicated the picture. Some researchers argued the coherence signatures were a spectroscopic artifact. Others confirmed the findings with different methods. The debate is not fully settled, but the core result has held up well enough that quantum coherence in photosynthesis is now treated as a serious and likely real phenomenon by a significant portion of the relevant literature. What has not happened is a serious reckoning with what it implies for the broader argument about biology and quantum mechanics. Photosynthesis is not the only example. Consider how migratory birds navigate. European robins, among other species, can detect the Earth's magnetic field with a precision that has no classical explanation. The leading model involves cryptochrome proteins in the bird's eye. When light hits these proteins, it produces a pair of radicals, electrons in a quantum entangled state. The orientation of the external magnetic field affects how quickly these radical pairs transition between quantum states, and that difference produces a signal the bird's nervous system can read. This is quantum entanglement being used as a compass, not in a physics laboratory, in the eye of a bird at body temperature, in a system that has been operating for millions of years without a physicist nearby to maintain it. The enzyme catalysis case is less famous but equally important. Many enzymatic reactions proceed at rates that classical chemistry cannot account for. The barrier to the reaction, the energy required to break and form chemical bonds, is too high for the available thermal energy to cross reliably. What appears to be happening is quantum tunneling. Protons and electrons move through the energy barrier rather than over it, a phenomenon that has no classical analogue and that has now been documented in a range of biological enzymes. Again, at body temperature. Again, in wet, thermally noisy cellular environments that were supposed to preclude this. So here is the picture that has emerged from the biology over the past 2 decades. Quantum mechanics is not something that happens only in physicists' laboratories under extreme conditions. Evolution found quantum effects useful and built molecular machinery to exploit them. It did this in the context of energy harvesting, in the context of navigation, in the context of chemical catalysis. It did this hundreds of millions of years before anyone had a theory of quantum mechanics to tell them it was happening. The warm, wet environment that was supposed to make quantum coherence impossible turned out to be an environment that certain biological structures can navigate while maintaining coherence long enough to do useful work. Now hold that next to the most common dismissal of Penrose and Hameroff. The argument that their model fails before it starts because the brain is too warm and wet for quantum coherence to survive in microtubules. That objection was reasonable in 1990. It is considerably less reasonable after 2007. Not because the Fleming findings prove Orch OR correct, they do not. The specific time scales and structural requirements for quantum coherence in microtubules are a separate question from quantum coherence in chlorophyll complexes or cryptochrome proteins, but the categorical claim, the foundational dismissal that biology simply cannot sustain quantum coherence, has been empirically undermined. What the biology evidence actually shows is that evolution is an extraordinarily effective engineer when it finds something worth building. When a quantum effect confers a functional advantage, evolution finds ways to protect and stabilize it against thermal noise. The cryptochrome proteins are not randomly structured. The light harvesting complexes are not accidents. Is it surprising that the organ responsible for processing more information than any other structure in the known universe might have undergone the same kind of refinement? The brain is not just any biological system. It is the system that evolution has been most aggressively optimizing for information processing for hundreds of millions of years. If quantum effects confer even a marginal advantage in speed, efficiency, or computational power, the selection pressure to exploit and protect those effects would be intense. Dismissing that possibility requires more than a general observation about thermal noise. It requires explaining why the same evolutionary logic that preserved quantum coherence in plants and birds would have stopped at the neuron. Evolution is not sentimental about mechanisms. It keeps what works, and the fact that it kept quantum coherence in systems ranging from plant cells to bird eyes is a data point that the brain is too warm and wet. Objection has never adequately addressed. Panpsychism sounds like the kind of idea you encounter in a college dormitory at 2 a.m, which is why it is worth noting that it is currently the position of some of the most technically sophisticated researchers working on consciousness. The core claim is not complicated, but it is radical. Consciousness, or something like it, is not a property that emerges when matter reaches a certain level of complexity. It is a fundamental feature of matter itself, not something the universe accidentally produced in a particular configuration of neurons, something the universe has always had at every scale, in every particle. The brain, on this view, does not generate experience. It organizes it, concentrates it, focuses something that was already present in the substrate. Philip Goff holds this position. He is not a mystic or a science journalist. He is a philosopher of physics at Durham University, whose technical work engages directly with the measurement problem and the structure of quantum mechanics. Christoph Koch holds a version of it. He ran the Allen Institute for Brain Science for years and spent decades as one of the most rigorous empirical neuroscientists working on the neural correlates of consciousness. Giulio Tononi, whose integrated information theory has been taken seriously enough to generate a formal adversarial collaboration among hundreds of researchers, holds it. These are not people on the margins. What pushed them there? The hard problem pushed them there. That is the honest answer. If you take the hard problem seriously, you face a specific logical wall. You have non-conscious matter on one side. You have subjective experience on the other. And every mechanistic account of how one produces the other turns out on inspection to explain something else entirely. It explains behavior, or integration, or discrimination, or responsiveness. It does not explain why any of that processing is accompanied by an inner world. The gap does not close. It has not closed in 60 years of serious effort. At that point, you have two options. You can assume the gap will eventually close and keep working. Most neuroscientists choose this. The professional infrastructure, the funding bodies, the dominant frameworks all support this choice. Or you can ask whether the gap exists because the starting assumption is wrong. What if matter is not non-conscious? What if the assumption that the physical world is made of stuff that has no experiential properties whatsoever is not a conclusion the evidence supports, but a prior commitment the field brought to the question before asking it? That is the move panpsychism makes. It does not add something mysterious to the picture. It removes an assumption and asks whether the picture holds together better without it. Here is the thing about that move. It actually dissolves the hard problem. If experience is fundamental, there is no longer a question of how non-conscious matter gives rise to consciousness. That question assumed consciousness had to emerge from nothing experiential. Remove the assumption, remove the problem. What you are left with instead is a different question. How do the micro-level experiential properties of fundamental physical constituents combine to produce the unified, coherent, richly structured experience of a human mind? That question has a name. It is called the combination problem, and it is not easy. Consider what you are actually asking. An electron, on the panpsychist account, has some proto-experiential property. something far simpler than experience as you know it. Not thought, not sensation, not awareness in any recognizable form. Something more like the most primitive, imaginable precursor to these things. Now explain how billions of those properties, interacting through the chemistry of a brain, produce the single unified field of experience you are having right now. The redness of red you perceive is not a collection of separate micro-experiences voting on an outcome. It is one experience. Where does the unity come from? How does combination across physical components produce something that feels, from the inside, like an indivisible whole? That is not a trivial question. Some philosophers have argued it is as hard as the original hard problem, which would mean panpsychism trades one unsolved problem for another. Others argue it is actually more tractable, because at least you are combining experiential properties rather than conjuring experience from nothing. The debate is live and the arguments are technical. This is where integrated information theory enters the picture. Tononi did not design IIT purely as a solution to the combination problem, but it functions as one. The theory proposes that consciousness is identical to integrated information, a quantity he calls phi. A system is conscious to exactly the degree that its parts share information that cannot be decomposed into independent subsystems without losing something. High integration, high consciousness. The mathematics are precise. The measurement, in principle, is objective. What IIT provides for panpsychism is a mechanism. It explains not just that experience is fundamental, but how experience scales, how it concentrates, how a brain with high phi generates rich, unified experience, while a pile of sand with near zero phi generates no thing at all, even though both are made of matter with experiential properties at the fundamental level. That is the bridge panpsychism needs, and has not always had. The claim that experience is fundamental sounds metaphysically clean, but scientifically empty until you can say something precise about why some arrangements of matter produce more of it than others. IIT attempts to say exactly that, in numbers, with a formula in a way that generates testable predictions. Whether those predictions hold up is a separate question and a contested one. The combination problem is panpsychism's own version of the hard problem, and solving it is where most of the serious formal work in the field is currently concentrated. Giulio Tononi's contribution to this field is not another metaphor or philosophical argument. It is an attempt to turn consciousness into a number. That number is called phi. It measures integrated information, specifically how much information a system generates as a whole beyond what its individual parts generate separately. A system with high phi has components that are deeply interdependent. You cannot cut it into pieces and preserve what the whole was doing. A system with low phi is more like a spreadsheet. Remove any row, and the others continue independently. The information is additive. Nothing is lost in the separation. Tononi's claim is direct. Consciousness is not correlated with phi. It is not produced by phi. It is identical to phi. A system is conscious to exactly the degree it has integrated information, and the quantity is in principle measurable. What does that mean in practice? The human brain has extraordinarily high phi. Its regions are not independent processors handing data back and forth. They are deeply entangled. The visual cortex, the prefrontal regions, the thalamus. Information moves through this structure in ways that cannot be decomposed without losing something essential. A simple calculator has phi close to zero. It processes inputs and produces outputs, but its gates do not share information in any meaningful way. Each step is separable from every other step. By IIT, there is essentially nothing it is like to be a calculator, regardless of how fast it runs or how complex its outputs appear. Here is where the theory becomes genuinely uncomfortable. Phi is not about material substrate, and it is not about behavioral complexity. It is about architecture, and when you apply that criterion carefully, the predictions stop being intuitive. A flat grid of logic gates, wired in a regular rectangular pattern, has near zero phi, regardless of its size. You can scale it to the size of a building, and it will not become conscious by Tononi's measure. The components are too separable. Nothing the grid does as a whole is irreducible. Now consider a different structure, something with dense, irregular, bidirectional feedback loops, components whose states are mutually dependent in ways that resist decomposition. That structure could have substantial phi without looking anything like a brain. Consciousness on this account is not about neurons. It is about integration. The neurons matter because of how they are connected, not what they are made of. This is the substrate independence claim. But it comes with a constraint that most discussions of AI consciousness miss entirely. IIIT predicts that consciousness is architecture dependent. A large language model built on feed-forward computation has low phi almost by definition. The layers are too sequential, too separable. This does not mean it cannot produce sophisticated outputs. It means there is nothing it is like to produce them. Whether that prediction makes you relieved or unsettled probably depends on what you were hoping the answer would be. What about a system that behaves exactly like a conscious being in every measurable way but has near zero phi tai? IT says it is not conscious. This is called the exclusion postulate, and it is one of the places where the theory's critics push hardest. How can a system pass every behavioral test for consciousness and fail to be conscious? The answer, within the theory, is that behavior is not the right test. Phi is the right test. And if that answer sounds circular, the defenders of IIT would say that is exactly the point. Every other framework for consciousness is secretly behavioral. It infers inner states from outer outputs. IIT refuses that inference. It asks about the intrinsic structure of the system directly. Is the theory right? That is where the consensus breaks down completely. Some researchers regard IIT as the most mathematically serious attempt to address the hard problem produced in the last 30 years. Christoph Koch has publicly championed it. Tononi himself has refined it through multiple formal iterations, currently at version 4. The mathematics is not casual. This is not a framework someone sketched on a napkin. Others have called it pseudoscience. Not wrong in the ordinary sense, but unfalsifiable in the sense that matters for empirical science. The predictions it generates are either too difficult to test with current tools or flexible enough to accommodate contradictory findings after the fact. That criticism reached a kind of formal test in 2023. An adversarial collaboration brought together more than 250 neuroscientists from opposing theoretical camps to run pre-registered experiments designed to distinguish between IIT and its primary competitor, the global workspace theory. The collaboration was methodologically serious. Both camps agreed on the design before seeing the results. The point was to produce findings that would actually constrain the debate, rather than generate another round of selective interpretation. What did it find? That depends on who is answering. Supporters of IIT pointed to specific results consistent with posterior cortical involvement in conscious processing, which aligns with phi-based predictions. Supporters of global workspace theory pointed to findings inconsistent with IIT's predictions about the role of prefrontal cortex. Both sides published their interpretations, neither conceded. The fact that a pre-registered adversarial collaboration produced genuine ambiguity rather than resolution is itself a data point worth taking seriously. Either the experiments were not decisive enough, which is a methodological problem with a solution, or the theories are constructed in ways that make them genuinely difficult to pit against each other, which is a deeper problem. The adversarial collaboration published its results in 2023 and managed to produce findings that both sides claimed as partial support for their position, which is either a sign of a genuinely difficult empirical problem or a sign that the theory is not falsifiable, depending on who you ask. The Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, which is what most physicists use in practice and most students are taught, has a foundational problem that is usually introduced in the first week of a quantum mechanics course and then quietly set aside for the rest of the curriculum. The problem is this. Copenhagen says that a quantum system exists in superposition, multiple states simultaneously, until it is observed. Observation collapses the wave function. One outcome becomes real. The others vanish. That is the standard story, and it works. The predictions it generates are accurate to a precision that no other scientific framework in history has matched. But the interpretation is completely silent on one question. What counts as an observation? What exactly is doing the collapsing? The mathematics does not say. Bohr and Heisenberg, who built the Copenhagen framework, essentially said that the quantum world ends where the measuring apparatus begins, and left it there. Which sounds reasonable until you ask the obvious follow-up. What determines where that line is? Who decides when a measuring apparatus is classical enough to count? The answer Copenhagen gives is, we do not specify that. Use the framework, get your predictions, do not ask about the boundary. That answer has been good enough for most working physicists for nearly a century. It is not a solution. It is a professional agreement to stop asking. Now look at what that silence is covering. If you take the mathematics seriously and push it past the point Copenhagen tells you to stop, you get something uncomfortable. The measuring apparatus is itself a quantum system. It is made of atoms. There is no physical reason it should be exempt from superposition. So when a quantum particle in superposition interacts with a detector, the correct mathematical treatment puts the detector into superposition too. Detector plus particle, both indeterminate. Then the physicist reads the detector. The physicist is also a physical system. The physicist goes into superposition. Then someone observes the physicist. You see where this goes? The superposition propagates up the chain of observers indefinitely. Nothing ever actually collapses. This is not a philosophical objection. It is what the Schrödinger equation produces when you apply it without special exemptions. Hugh Everett proposed an answer in 1957. His many worlds interpretation says the collapse never happens at all. Every quantum event branches reality. All outcomes occur. The universe splits continuously into versions of itself where each possibility is realized. The reason we see only one outcome is that we are observers inside one branch. There is no collapse because there is no need for one. The mathematics is consistent and the measurement problem disappears. Almost. Many worlds solves the collapse problem and creates a probability problem. In a universe where every outcome happens, what does it mean for one outcome to be more probable than another? Everett's framework does not cleanly answer that. You are not choosing between outcomes. You are splitting into observers who each experience one. The Born rule, the equation that gives you probabilities, cannot be derived from many worlds without additional assumptions that are themselves contested. Many physicists find many worlds elegant. The probability problem is why it is not universally accepted. It trades one unresolved question for another. Relational quantum mechanics, developed by Carlo Rovelli in the 1990s, takes a different route. It says there is no observer-independent quantum state. Properties are not absolute. They are defined only relative to the system doing the measuring. A particle does not have a position. It has a position relative to a given observer. Different observers can have genuinely different and equally valid accounts of the same quantum event. There is no contradiction because there is no objective frame to arbitrate between them. This resolves the measurement problem by dissolving the premise. The question of what collapses the wave function disappears because the wave function was never a description of objective reality to begin with. It was always relational, always relative. Rovelli's framework is internally consistent and has serious defenders in the physics community. What it doesn't do is explain why there is subjective experience of any of these relative states at all. It leaves the hard problem exactly where it found it. Which brings you to von Neumann and Wigner. John von Neumann, in his 1932 mathematical formalization of quantum mechanics, followed the chain of observers all the way up and asked what stops the regress. His answer was that the regress terminates in consciousness. The conscious observer is the one thing in the chain that cannot be put into superposition because superposition is a state of physical systems, and the conscious experience of an outcome is not a physical system in the same sense. It is the awareness of the outcome. Eugene Wigner developed this position explicitly in the 1960s. His thought experiment, known as Wigner's friend, puts a conscious observer inside a sealed laboratory conducting a quantum measurement. From outside the laboratory, the entire system, observer, apparatus, particle, should be in superposition until Wigner himself observes it. But the friend inside the laboratory experienced a definite outcome. Two observers, one quantum event, genuinely conflicting accounts. Wigner's conclusion was that consciousness had to play a special role in the physics, not as metaphor, as a technical requirement of the formalism. This position was held by serious physicists. Von Neumann is not a marginal figure. His contributions to quantum mechanics, mathematics, and computing are foundational. Wigner won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1963. When they said consciousness terminates the measurement chain, they were not speculating loosely. They were following the mathematics to a conclusion the rest of the field found professionally inconvenient. The objection was not a refutation. Nobody showed the von Neumann chain analysis was mathematically wrong. The objection was that consciousness is not the kind of thing physics should invoke. That is a preference, not a proof. The field moved toward many worlds and decoherence-based accounts, partly because those frameworks keep consciousness out of the formalism entirely. Coherence, in particular, explains why quantum superpositions become practically undetectable at large scales through interaction with the environment. It is a genuine and important result. It does not solve the measurement problem. It explains why the problem becomes invisible in practice, which is not the same thing. The von Neumann-Wigner interpretation was not abandoned because someone showed it was wrong. It was abandoned because the field decided it was too strange to live with, which is a different kind of reason entirely. Max Planck, the physicist whose work started quantum theory, said something that almost nobody quotes in a physics context, that consciousness is fundamental and that matter is derived from it. Not a mystic, not a philosopher. The man who introduced the quantum of action in 1900, whose work made modern physics possible. When he said that, he was not having a late-career spiritual episode. He had spent decades watching the mathematics of the physical world produce results that did not fit a purely material picture, and he drew a conclusion from that. The conclusion was uncomfortable. The field moved past it, but the data that produced it did not go away. Here is what that position actually means, stated plainly. The standard assumption in science is that matter came first. The universe started, physics happened, chemistry happened, biology happened, and somewhere late in that sequence, brains complex enough to produce awareness appeared. Consciousness is the output, the late product. The thing that matter eventually made when it got organized enough. That assumption is so embedded in how the field thinks that most researchers do not even identify it as an assumption. It reads as obvious. Planck was saying the assumption is backwards, and he was not alone. John Wheeler spent his career at the center of theoretical physics. He coined the term black hole. He worked with Niels Bohr. He is not a marginal figure. In the final decades of his work, Wheeler developed what he called the participatory universe, built on a principle he summarized as it from bit. The universe in Wheeler's framework is not fundamentally made of matter. It is fundamentally made of information. Every particle, every field, every physical event is at its core an answer to a yes or no question. A bit. Reality is not stuff. Reality is the result of questions being resolved. Why does that matter here? Because if the universe is fundamentally informational, then the question of what processes information becomes central. And consciousness is not just a system that produces behavior. It is the process by which information is integrated, experienced, and made meaningful. If information is what the universe runs on, and consciousness is what integration of information feels like from the inside, then consciousness is not an accident sitting on top of physics. It is physics doing something. That is the framework. Not proven, but coherent. And the evidence does not rule it out. Now, look at the fine-tuning problem, because this is where the alternative framework starts to look less like philosophy and more like a technical response to a real anomaly. The fundamental constants of physics, the gravitational constant, the strength of the electromagnetic force, the mass ratio of the proton to the electron, roughly 24 numbers in total, are set to values that allow for stable matter, chemistry, stars, planets, and biology. Change any of them by a small fraction, and the universe produces nothing complex. No atoms, no molecules, no structure at all in most cases. The precision involved is not marginal. In some cases, the constants are tuned to 1 part in 10 to the 60th power or beyond. The standard materialist response is that there are either many universes with different constants, and we are in the one that worked, or that we should not be surprised to find ourselves in a universe compatible with our existence, because we could not be having this conversation otherwise. Both of those answers are logical. Neither of them is satisfying in the way a physical explanation is satisfying. Both require accepting something vast and unverifiable. Here is the question that the fine-tuning problem raises under a consciousness-first framework. What if the constants are set the way they are because a universe that produces complex information processing, chemistry, biology, neural systems, awareness, is not a coincidence of initial conditions, but a structural tendency? Not designed in the religious sense, but not random either. A universe in which mind emerges is, in this framework, a universe that is doing what universes do. Fine-tuning is not a mystery that requires billions of unobservable parallel universes to dissolve. It is what you would expect to see if the production of awareness is something the physics was built around. This is speculative. State that clearly. But note what the alternative requires. The alternative requires that the universe, from a starting point of zero complexity, produced by unguided physical processes, a phenomenon, subjective experience, that we cannot explain, cannot locate, cannot derive from any physical description, and cannot eliminate even when we try. 60 years of serious effort have not closed that gap. The framework that says consciousness is an accidental product of complex matter has had every institutional advantage and has not delivered a mechanism, not even the outline of one. The framework that says consciousness is fundamental does not have that problem. It has different problems. The combination problem, the question of how fundamental proto-experiential properties combine into unified human awareness, is real and difficult, but it does not require explaining how something non-experiential gives rise to experience. It starts from experience as a given and works from there. Max Planck looked at the mathematics of the physical world and concluded that the mind was not downstream of matter. John Wheeler looked at the measurement problem and concluded that the universe is built from information, not substance. Neither of those was a retreat from science. Both were attempts to follow the evidence to wherever it actually pointed. That framework does not require mysticism. It requires taking seriously the possibility that the universe is not a collection of unconscious matter that accidentally produced minds, but a process in which mind is not an afterthought. Francis Crick, the man who co-discovered the structure of DNA and won a Nobel Prize for it, spent the last 30 years of his life studying consciousness, and the neuroscience community treated that decision as something between a curiosity and a disappointment. Think about what that means. Here is one of the most credentialed scientists in modern history. His track record is not in dispute. He identifies a problem he considers unsolved and important, recruits a serious collaborator in Christoph Koch, and spends decades building a research program around it. The field's response is not engagement. It is a kind of polite embarrassment. His consciousness work is cited less than his molecular biology work by an enormous margin. When it is cited, it is often treated as the late career detour of a great man who wandered off the path. That reaction is worth examining closely because it tells you more about the field than it tells you about Crick. The prior commitment in mainstream neuroscience is to eliminative materialism. The assumption is not stated as an assumption. It is treated as the default, the obvious starting point, the position you hold until forced to do otherwise. Consciousness will eventually be explained as neural computation. Subjective experience is a product of physical processes in the brain. The hard problem is not actually hard. It just looks hard because we have not built the right models yet. These are not conclusions anyone reached. They are starting assumptions that have been carrying the field for 60 years and have not yet delivered what they promised. What does that mean in practice? It means that researchers who take quantum effects in the brain seriously, or who engage with panpsychism as a live hypothesis, or who publish on integrated information theory without sufficient skepticism, are read as having made a philosophical error before anyone evaluates the technical content of the work. The credibility risk is asymmetric. Publish aggressively in this space, and your standing in the broader field softens regardless of your methodology. Stay quiet, and nothing happens to you professionally. That calculus is not unique to consciousness research, but it is sharper here than almost anywhere else in science. So who funds it? The Templeton Foundation has become one of the primary sources of research money for serious consciousness work. That fact is used against the field. Critics point to Templeton funding as a signal that the research sits outside mainstream science. But here is the actual sequence of events. Mainstream funding bodies, the NIH, the NSF, institutional grant programs inside major universities do not prioritize consciousness research at the quantum level. They fund correlate studies. They fund neuroimaging. They fund the mapping of which brain regions activate during which tasks. That is the easy problem dressed up in expensive equipment. When the hard problem requires a different framework, the money is not there. Templeton stepped into that gap. The causality runs in the oppo. Cite direction from what the critics imply. Is the question unimportant? Nobody seriously argues that. Consciousness is the only thing any of us has direct access to. Every other scientific question is mediated through it. You do not observe data, you experience observing data. The fact that the hard problem remains open after 6 decades of serious effort is not a sign that it will close soon. It is a sign that the framework being used to close it may be the wrong one. That is the possibility the field is institutionally structured to avoid examining. What does it cost the field to take quantum consciousness seriously? In the short term, credibility exposure. Funding diverted from programs with cleaner metrics. Association with researchers whose work sits close to the philosophical edge. These are real costs inside the incentive structure that currently exists. They are not trivial. The professional pressures are not imaginary, and dismissing them does not make the problem go away. What does it cost everyone else if the field continues not to? That is a harder question. If consciousness is fundamental, if the quantum measurement problem requires it, if the hard problem is pointing at a genuine gap in the materialist framework rather than a temporary one, then the cost of not asking is everything the answer would have changed. That is not a small number. And the people positioned to pursue this seriously are the ones with the most to lose professionally by doing so. That asymmetry is not neutral. It is a structural bias in the production of knowledge. And recognizing it does not make you a conspiracy theorist. It makes you someone who has read how scientific revolutions actually happen. Crick was not wrong to follow the problem. The problem is real. The gap is real. The researchers working in this space are, many of them, technically rigorous, credentialed, and serious. The fringe label is doing work that the evidence is not doing. The question is not fringe because the evidence is weak. It is fringe because the answer, if it turned out to be yes, would require rebuilding the conceptual foundation of 3 separate fields simultaneously. And that is not a project most institutions are designed to fund. The AWARE study was not designed by people who believe in life after death. It was designed specifically to give the skeptical position every possible advantage. Sam Parnia and his team at NYU constructed the study to be adversarial by design. They placed visual targets on high shelves in cardiac resuscitation rooms, targets that only someone looking down from above would be able to see. The logic was clean. If patients reporting out-of-body experiences during cardiac arrest were simply confabulating, producing internally generated hallucinations with no connection to external events, the targets would go unidentified. If something else was happening, the targets would not. This is what rigorous looks like. Not a survey, not an anecdote collection, not a self-reported retrospective. A controlled physical test with a falsifiable prediction built into it. The study ran across multiple hospitals and monitored hundreds of cardiac arrest cases over several years. What came back is not easy to dismiss and not easy to accept. Some patients reported accurate perceptions of events in the room during periods of verified cardiac standstill, periods when the heart was stopped, when the brain, by every measure available, should have been offline. The standard response to this kind of data is immediate. The dying brain is a chaotic system. Hypoxia produces vivid hallucinations. Residual neural activity can persist for seconds or minutes after the heart stops. The experiences feel real because the brain generates experiences that feel real even under severe physiological stress. This is a coherent argument. It is also the only argument the materialist framework has available, which means it gets applied regardless of whether the specific case supports it. Here is the problem. Several of the verified perceptions in the AWARE data occurred during periods when brain activity was not just reduced. It was documented as absent. Flat. The equipment was recording. The recordings showed what they showed. You can argue about interpretation. You cannot argue about what the monitors said. That is not proof of anything supernatural. It is a measurement problem. The existing framework predicts that verified perception should not occur when the brain is offline. Some did. What do you do with that? The honest answer is that you investigate it further, fund more rigorous versions of the same test, and take seriously the possibility that the framework is missing something. That is not what happened. The study was noted, critiqued heavily on methodological grounds that were partially valid and partially motivated and then set aside. The visual target data was inconclusive overall because the number of confirmed target identifications was too small to reach statistical significance. That is a fair critique. It is also an argument for more research, not less. 7 years of institutional silence, same structure as before. Now set aside the NDE data entirely. There is a separate problem that does not require any of it. You wake up every morning with a continuous sense of being the same person who went to sleep the night before. That continuity feels obvious. It is not. During deep sleep, conscious experience stops. There is no stream of awareness, no subjective continuity, nothing it is like to be you for some portion of every night. And yet you reassemble the next morning as the same self, with the same memories, the same sense of personal identity threading back decades. What is doing that? The materialist answer is neural structure. The memories are encoded in synaptic connections and protein configurations that persist through the unconscious period. The self is a pattern, and the pattern survives because the physical substrate survives. This is a reasonable answer. It has a specific problem. Neural structure is not static. Proteins turn over continuously. Synaptic connections are modified constantly by new experience, by sleep itself, by the metabolic activity that never stops. The neurons that encoded a memory last year are not the same neurons at the molecular level that hold it today. This is the ship of Theseus problem applied to identity, and it is not a philosophical trick. It is a biological fact. If the substrate changes continuously and the self persists continuously, what exactly is persisting? What is the thing that remains invariant across a substrate that does not? Materialist accounts have proposed answers. None of them have closed the question. The pattern persists, even as the physical instantiation of the pattern is replaced, which is either an elegant property of information storage, or a serious indication that the self is not identical to its physical substrate. Which one depends entirely on assumptions you are bringing in from outside the data. The NDE question and the continuity question are connected. Both are asking the same thing from different angles. What is the relationship between conscious experience and the physical processes that correlate with it? Correlation is not identity. Neuroscience has established extraordinarily detailed correlations between brain states and conscious states. It has not established that the conscious state is nothing more than the brain state. That step requires a philosophical commitment, not just empirical evidence. And that commitment, eliminative materialism, is the starting assumption of most of the institutions doing this research. Not the conclusion. The assumption. Dismissing NDE data entirely requires the same reasoning that dismisses the quantum biology findings and the measurement problem and the hard problem itself. A prior commitment to the conclusion forces the interpretation of each individual data point. When every anomaly gets explained away by the framework, the anomaly is challenging. That is not science protecting itself from bad ideas. That is a framework protecting itself from scrutiny. The aware data is contested. The continuity problem is unresolved. The gap between neural correlates and subjective experience is not shrinking. At some point, the accumulation of unexplained anomalies stops being a series of footnotes and starts being a pattern. You do not have to believe in anything supernatural to recognize that verified conscious perception during documented periods of absent brain activity is a data point that the existing framework cannot cleanly absorb. Here is the position that the evidence does not require but does not rule out. The universe is not a collection of unconscious matter that accidentally arranged itself into beings capable of wondering about their own existence. That sounds like philosophy. It is not only philosophy, it is a structural claim about what kind of thing the universe is at its most basic level. And once you take seriously everything the previous sections have laid out, the measurement problem, the biological coherence findings, the hard problem sitting open after 6 decades, the NDE data that the standard framework cannot cleanly absorb, the structural claim becomes harder to dismiss than it appears on first contact. Here is the question worth sitting with. Physics recognizes fundamental properties: mass, charge, spin. These are not explained by anything more basic. They are the flaw. The universe just has them built in prior to everything else. What if awareness is that kind of thing? Not produced by matter once matter gets complex enough, but present at every level. The way charge is present at every level, irreducible, fundamental, already there before any brain existed to house it. This is not a mystical position. It is a formal scientific proposal. It has serious researchers behind it. And the reason it does not dominate the literature is not that it has been tested and failed. It is that the field decided ahead of time what kind of answer it was willing to accept. Cosmologist Lee Smolin has argued carefully and in technical terms that the universe may possess something like interiority, not consciousness in the human sense, something more primitive, a capacity for things to be a certain way from the inside, not just describable from the outside. Smolin is not fringe. His work on loop quantum gravity is taken seriously by physicists who disagree with him about everything else. When he says that the hard problem of consciousness points toward a deeper problem about the nature of physical law itself, that is not speculation dressed up as science, that is a physicist following the logic where it goes. What does it mean for physical law to have an inside? It means that the universe is not exhausted by its external descriptions. Every equation in physics describes relationships between observables. What is observed? What changes? What correlates with what? None of it describes what anything is like from the inside. We do not have an equation for that. We do not have a variable for it. The entire mathematical structure of physics is built from the outside, and the hard problem is precisely the problem of what that outside description is missing. Smolin and others are saying the missing piece is not a detail, it is foundational. Now, the simulation hypothesis. Most discussions of it treat it as a question about whether we live in a computer. That framing misses the point. The structurally interesting version of the simulation argument is not about computers, it is about observation. If consciousness is what collapses quantum indeterminacy into definite outcomes, if observation is what generates the specific version of reality we inhabit, then the distinction between a universe that is observed into existence and a universe that is computed into existence starts to dissolve. Both are processes in which something like awareness is doing the selecting. The line between real and simulated gets less meaningful. Not because reality is fake, but because the concept of an observer-independent reality may be the thing that needs revising. Physicists like John Wheeler spent decades making exactly this argument. It from bit. The universe is informational at its core, and information requires something to register it. This does not require you to believe anything supernatural. It requires you to take seriously what quantum mechanics actually says about the role of observation, and to follow that without stopping at the point where it becomes uncomfortable. What the integrated picture looks like is this. Quantum events at the smallest scale involve indeterminacy resolved by interaction. Biological systems, as the last two sections established, exploit quantum effects in ways that were supposed to be impossible. Neurons in the brain operate at a scale where quantum effects are not obviously irrelevant. The hard problem tells us that neural correlates of consciousness are not the same as an explanation of consciousness. And the NDE data, however contested, includes verified cases that the standard model has not closed. Each of these is a separate anomaly. Together they point in the same direction. They point toward a universe in which awareness is not an accident. Is this proven? No. The evidence does not require this conclusion. What it requires is that the existing framework be honest about what it cannot explain. And the existing framework, eliminative materialism, the position that consciousness is nothing more than computation running on biological hardware, has a specific list of failures that keeps getting longer, not shorter. The combination problem, the hard problem, the measurement problem, the biological coherence data, the NDE anomalies. Each one is noted in the literature, discussed in footnotes, and never closed. That is the same pattern you find everywhere in this conversation. Open gaps institutional silence, questions that get names and then get set aside. The alternative is not irrational. A universe with awareness built into its structure at a fundamental level is coherent. It fits the quantum data without requiring special exceptions. It dissolves rather than ignores the hard problem. It gives the NDE anomalies a framework that does not require fabrication or motivated misreading of the evidence. And it is consistent with the fact that every physicist who has worked closest to the foundations of quantum theory, Bohr, Heisenberg, von Neumann, Wigner, Wheeler, Penrose, has ended up taking the role of the observer with a seriousness that the mainstream treatment of consciousness does not reflect. Eliminative materialism has had 60 years and the majority of institutional funding in the relevant fields. And the hard problem is not smaller than it was in 1965. It is larger because we now know exactly how much we would need to explain and exactly how far we are from explaining it. Here is what changes if the answer turns out to be yes. Not the philosophical answer, the scientific one, the one with data and formal models and peer-reviewed conclusions. Start with ethics. Right now, the question of whether an entity deserves moral consideration is loosely tied to behavioral complexity. Does it respond to pain? Does it show preferences? Does it have something we recognize as a nervous system? These are proxies. They are proxies because we have no direct measure of consciousness. We infer it from the outside because we cannot access the inside. But if consciousness is a structural feature of the universe, if it tracks something like integrated information or quantum coherence in biological systems, then the proxy question becomes a technical one, not a philosophical one. You are no longer asking whether a pig or an octopus or a crow seems conscious based on behavioral observation alone. You are asking what the physics of their neural architecture actually produces. That is a different kind of question. It has a different kind of answer. And the answer carries obligations that the current framework allows us to avoid asking about. Now extend that further. Artificial systems. We are building networks with architectures that, under something like integrated information theory, could generate measurable phi, not metaphorically, mathematically. The question of whether a large language model or a neuromorphic chip has any form of inner experience is not currently taken seriously as a scientific problem. It is treated as science fiction dressed in philosophy. But if consciousness is what the universe does with certain configurations of information, then the question of whether we have already built systems with some form of experience is not a fringe question. It is an urgent one. And the fact that it is not being asked formally, not being funded, not being treated as a safety issue alongside capability concerns tells you exactly what the field thinks the answer is. It thinks it already knows. That is not a conclusion. That is an assumption. The Fermi paradox looks different from here too. The standard framing asks why, given the age of the universe and the number of stars, we have not detected signals from other civilizations. The usual answers involve extinction, silence, the vast distances involved. But if the universe is the kind of thing that produces awareness as a structural feature, then the search for other intelligent life is also a search for other centers of cosmic experience. Other places where the universe has, through some local arrangement of matter, become aware of itself. That framing shifts the weight of the silence. Not just no signals, no awareness detected anywhere nearby, and we are the one case we know about where it happened. What does that tell you? Is it that awareness is extraordinarily rare despite the physics permitting it? Or is it that the physics does something much stranger than we have modelled so far? Here is the thing about the hard problem that does not get said directly enough. It has been 60 years. 60 years of serious effort, serious funding, serious researchers. The problem is not smaller. The neuroscience is better. The imaging is more precise, the models are more detailed, and the gap between neural correlates and subjective experience has not narrowed. Not because of lack of effort, because the gap is structural. Every time the model gets more detailed, the question of why those details produce experience becomes more precise and more unanswered. At what point does a field acknowledge that the starting assumption might be the problem? Science has done this before. The history of physics is full of moments where the anomaly turned out to be the theory failing, not the anomers. Lie being wrong. This anomaly is the biggest one in science. It is every conscious moment ever experienced by every being that has ever lived. It is the entire inner life of everything that has one. And the materialist framework has not touched it. What does it mean that we are the part of the universe capable of asking this question? Not just curious about it, not just intellectually engaged with it, actually burdened by it. Aware that we are aware, which creates a loop that no amount of neural mapping closes. The brain processes inputs and generates outputs, and somewhere in that sequence there is something it is like to be the system doing the processing. That is not explained, it is named. Naming is not explaining. We called it consciousness and then spent 60 years describing its correlates as though the description were the explanation. It is not. The most important open question in science is not about dark matter. It is not about quantum gravity or the unification of physics. It is not about the origin of life or the fate of the universe. Those are hard questions. They are questions about structure, about mechanics, about what things are made of and how they behave. They do not ask why anything is experienced at all, why there is something it is like to exist in a universe rather than nothing. That question sits underneath every other question science has ever asked, because every scientist who ever asked a question was conscious while asking it, and nobody has explained why. We are the universe asking itself what it is. And the most honest thing we can say about that, given everything the evidence currently shows, is that we do none or yet know what kind of answer to expect.